Hello, I'm Peter Weise, and this is my teaching demo for my application to be an English instructor at the University of Michigan Xiaozhang University Joint Institute. It comes as if I'm teaching the introduction to the second unit of a composition course with the topic of ecology. All right. So in this course, we have two basic goals. The first goal for us is to develop our skills in careful, slow reading. And the second goal is for us to develop our skills in academic writing. For that first goal, what we've been doing to become better readers is to ask two questions. We started the first section on Philip K. Dick's novel by asking, what do we notice in this text, and what do we think that means? And we developed ways of noticing a number of different things in a novel. We looked at different literary elements, we looked at textual patterns, we looked at contrasts, and we looked at anomalies. And we put all of that together, and we said, what does that mean? How do we want to interpret that? And then in regard to our skills in academic writing, what we've been asking ourselves is, what does an academic audience expect from us? And so we've gone over some of the stylistic expectations that are required in the sorts of essays that you're writing for this course, but then also beyond in other kinds of writing that you would have to do as a student or in graduate school. One of the major requirements is that you show your evidence, you set it up, you give it context, and you don't take for granted that your reader knows what it means. You explain what it means, and then you also link it up with your argument, your thesis statement, and show how it develops that thesis statement. We talked about how an introduction needs to be specific to a particular topic, and it needs to narrow towards a thesis that is then developed through the rest of the paper. We also talked about how in your body paragraphs you need to have introductions and transitions, and all of that needs to come together to provide your reader a way of walking through your particular argument. In this next section of the class, we're going to continue to address all of those questions in regard to reading, improving our skills in reading, and then also improving our skills in academic writing. But instead of asking, what do I notice and what does this mean in regard to a novel, we're going to ask, what do I notice and what does this mean in regard to specific arguments? So, of course, we're interested in different ecological problems. And in this section, we're going to be engaging in the debate over how to solve specific ecological problems, global warming generally, but also a range of other things. And what we want to do at this point in the course is look at how different authors are constructing their arguments. What do I actually notice that allows this author to make this argument? And what might that tell me about how good this argument is? We're not yet going to be trying to agree or disagree with the argument or the arguments that we're reading. That's what you get to do in the third section of the class, where you write a research paper. And in that research paper, you're going to be using multiple texts. You're going to be engaging with a number of different authors, and you're going to be coming up with your own argument about what should be done to confront global warming, or more specifically, some problem, some ecological problem. But before we get there, before we go to that larger project of the research paper where you agree or disagree, I wanted us to slow down and think about how we actually should analyze an argument. That's going to help us think about how we can construct our own argument, and then also how we can engage with just two different texts that are making an argument, right? So we're going to be very deliberate in analyzing an argument and then comparing two different arguments to see how they function in order to address a particular topic. So the goal of this section then is to do that, to do a comparison and contrast assignment through analyzing different arguments. So the writing assignment for this section is to do a comparison and contrast essay. Now, you might ask yourself, why is this even important to do an analysis of an argument? What does this do for me? Doing this sort of analysis is key for, I would suggest, living an enlightened life, where you're thinking through facts and reasons and other things to engage meaningfully with the world. Also, if you're doing any sort of analysis that is going to be adopted by a larger body of people, the consequences can be quite significant. And I have an example for you here. In the United States right now, the opioid epidemic is a very serious problem. Doctors for about a decade or two have been prescribing various kinds of painkillers to people with chronic pain. And what has been happening is that many of these patients have been wanting to get higher and higher off of their medicine, and so they've gone to heroin in order to get high and other kinds of street drugs. All of this might seem quite distant from the issue of an analysis of an argument, but what Sam Quinones has actually shown is that part of the problem was caused because doctors misread research that was produced in the early 1980s. There were two doctors, Jick and Porter, who were trying to understand in 1980 whether or not opioid use, the use of these painkillers in hospitals, led to patients becoming addicted. And what they found was that in a small group of patients that were in a hospital, the patients did not become addicted when a team of doctors was using very precise doses to take care of pain while they were in the hospital. So this was published in 1980, and then it got picked up in various medical journals as evidence that anyone who used opioids would not become addicted, that there was a very small chance that anyone who used them would not become addicted. And so what we see here is that medical doctors were not analyzing the argument precisely. They were publishing that opioids were safe for people to use, and this eventually led to articles being published for wide audiences. It got published in Time magazine. And this partially led to doctors prescribing more and more opioids because of this misreading. Now, I'm not saying that, when you write your essay that an incorrect analysis is going to lead to an opioid epidemic. That's foolish. But what I am saying that this is an important skill, and it can be very beneficial for you going forward. So what are the specific arguments that we're actually going to be analyzing that have to do with ecological problems? So we're going to read three different texts, selections from three different books. The first one is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It's a classic for environmentalist literature. It makes the claim that humans have destroyed the environment. It was published in the 60s, and that we need to rethink what we're doing. The second book is by Bill McKibben. It's called Deep Economy. Bill McKibben has been very important in the environmentalist movement. And then the third book is by Stuart Brand, and it's called Whole Earth Discipline. And that's actually what's going to get us into doing some of the analysis today. So what I want to do is first read for you the selection that I have from Stuart Brand's text, and this is what we're going to be discussing. This comes from the section of his book, Whole Earth Discipline, where he is discussing how different countries in the world have been affected by global warming and what sort of resources they might have to respond to the problem. And I thought Brand sort of here could pick up where we left off with Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Because Brand here is writing about a robotic solution to labor shortages. And so here's what he writes. Because Japan welcomes no immigrants, it is facing the world's worst elder care crisis. At Global Business Network, we predict that Japan's standard solution to labor problems will be applied. Highly sophisticated, lovable robots and robotic environments will take care of Japan's elderly, and then the technology will spread to the rest of the developed world. All right, so not a terribly complicated argument here, just a few sentences. But what I want to do is go over the steps that I think you can follow in order to begin to analyze these arguments that you're going to be reading in these texts. So there are 7 steps here, but it's kind of misleading because the first and last step are exactly the same, and that's to spin us back through the cycle again and again in doing more and more analysis. So the first step here is simply to ask, to what extent do I believe this argument, and to what extent do I not believe this argument? And I phrase it in this way because it's important for us in doing this to move beyond asking, do I agree or do I disagree? We want to think in a much more nuanced way about these arguments. And so tagging on the phrase to what extent gets us to think about the degree to which an argument might be true and the degree to which it might be false. And so here, if we look at this argument by Brand, I might say that yes, it seems that it could be true. Because Japan welcomes no immigrants, it's facing the world's worst elder care crisis. One thing I'd want to know there is, are those actually facts? I don't have anything in the text that points me towards a citation there. So I might say, yeah, if these facts are true, then I would believe this argument. But if these facts are not true, then I can't go along with this argument. And at that point, I need to then go do some research myself or look in other areas of the book that Brand's written to see if he provides more specific evidence. The second step is to ask myself, do I understand all the terms, all the references that are being made in this argument? And I think I understand, most of these terms here. One term that I don't understand unless I've read the rest of the book is the phrase global business network. I'm going to talk about that here in a second. The other thing that I didn't know about when I read this for the first time was the phrase here, highly sophisticated, lovable robots in Japan. And so I actually looked it up, and that's one thing that I would encourage you to do in order to make sure you understand these arguments. And so what I found very funny, I did a Google search on Japanese robots, and then I clicked on images, and what was kind of funny was one of the first images that I clicked on was of this robot, and then a link to an article that said, what was the tagline? That the Japanese will use robots to aid the elderly and the disabled. So it was funny when I went to go look for some sort of confirmation of what's going on in this argument, the first thing I found did confirm it. So I found that kind of ironic. And so that I would encourage you to do that in this second step to make sure I'm understanding everything that's being referred to here. The third thing that I can ask myself is, what's the cultural context of the argument? Where is the author coming from? What's happening outside of the text that's an important factor in understanding the text in front of me? So one thing that's happening outside the text is global warming. But another thing that's happening outside the text that seems pretty important here is the global business network that's mentioned. What is that? How is the global business network somehow allowing this author to make this prediction that Japan's standard solution to problems is going to be applied here? That's something I would want to do some research on. And this is sort of a different way of posing the second question about references and terms. The fourth thing that I want to think about are the various kinds of appeals that the author is making. Appeals are methods that an author uses to try to persuade an audience. And there are three different kinds. There is an emotional appeal. So this is when an author tries to make us feel something, and it's often tied to something that we believe in, that we value very deeply. The second kind of appeal that an author makes is an ethical appeal. This is often to get us to think about who the author is, what sort of position the author has, what sort of credibility does that author have? Do we find that author to be trustworthy? Do we think they have a good moral character? What allows them to make the specific argument that they're making? And then the third kind of appeal, and this is the kind that I've been saying is very standard for academic writing, is a logical appeal. That is the use of evidence, the use of facts, and their interpretation, arguments made about what they mean or the significance that they should have. All right, so if we take that sort of question, what are the appeals being made here? What do we see in this passage? Right, I'll just read it again. Because Japan welcomes no immigrants, it is facing the world's worst elder care crisis. That seems to me to be a logical appeal. There are facts supposedly being drawn on there and reasons being put forth. The second sentence, at Global Business Network, we predict that Japan's standard solution to labor problems will be applied. Well, that seems to be more of an ethical appeal, where we're thinking about the position of the author as being a part of the global business network, right? It's allowing for that position that the author has allows for him to make a prediction. And then the third sentence, highly sophisticated, lovable robots and robotic environments will take care of Japan's elderly, and then the technology will spread to the rest of the developed world. This is simply a restatement, a specific way of putting the prediction that the author has made. So it's building on that ethical appeal that the author set up. So the next thing I can do actually builds on that analysis of appeals, and that is thinking about possible fallacies. And we're going to go over a lot of different fallacies that we might be able to look for in an argument. But what we might notice here in this use of an ethical appeal is actually the setup of a false authority. To what extent can we say that simply throwing out the phrase global business network is persuasive? What allows us to believe that's a good basis for this prediction? Now, we would need to read the rest of Stewart's book to give that a fair assessment. He does talk about the global business network that he's a part of and the sort of research that they've done. But at the same time, if we're trying to think through a serious problem like an elder care crisis in Japan, how much do we really want to rely simply on authority? The sixth step is actually the use of Stephen Tomlin's framework for thinking through arguments, and we'll come back to that later in this section. And then finally, after we've done this sort of analysis of an argument, we want to come back to our original question, which is, to what extent do I believe this argument, and to what extent do I not believe this argument? How well is this argument constructed? And I think what we could say here is that we still need to do some reading in order to make a sort of robust assessment of these three sentences by Stewart. But what we might be able to say is that, sort of setting aside this research that we need to continue to do, what we've noticed is that he relies on both logical and ethical appeals. He doesn't seem to rely on emotional appeals. And as long as his ethical appeal is to a substantial research entity, the Global Business Network, then we may be able to believe his argument, but that we may not want to rely on it as a basis for authority for such an important topic. So that's the sort of analysis that I'm going to ask for you to do in this section. You're going to be doing this analysis on these three different texts that I mentioned. And what we're going to be doing over the next couple weeks is doing that specific analysis, and then we'll begin to think about how we can compare and contrast those different analyses of different texts, and then how to rhetorically structure a paper so that we can clearly demonstrate to a reader how we've come to assess these different arguments as we have. So that's it, and that's my demo. Thanks for watching, and I will hopefully talk to you guys later.